This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
This episode is brought to you by Companion. Iris and Josh seem like the perfect match, but when a weekend getaway turns into a nightmare, Iris realizes that things aren't as perfect as they appear. From the creators of Barbarian and the studio that brought you The Notebook comes a twisted tale of modern romance and the sweet satisfaction of revenge. Companion, only in theaters January 31st. Rated R, under 17, not admitted without parent.
Hello, I'm Dana Stevens, and this is the Slate Culture Gabfest Chalamet Goes Electric edition. It's Wednesday, January 22nd, 2024, and this week we'll be discussing, first off, A Complete Unknown, the new film directed by James Mangold that stars Timothée Chalamet as Bob Dylan, specifically focusing on the moment in the 60s when Dylan went from rising folk balladeer to confirmed rock star. We will also talk about On Call, a new cop show on Prime Video that's executive produced by old school broadcast TV guru Dick Wolf, the creator of Law and Order and its many spin-offs. Finally, we will celebrate and mourn and puzzle over the enigmatic life's work of the great filmmaker David Lynch, dead last week at the age of 78. I am joined today, after a few weeks of absence, by critic Stephen Metcalf, now back from his 3-week-long sojourn in Australia. Hey, Stephen.
Hey.
I have so many questions about Australia, but I'm hoping that you will maybe later on in the show, maybe in your endorsement segment, give us a little bit of the tales of what you did there.
I got answers.
It is so nice to have you back. We missed you.
Thank you.
Yeah, we missed you. I want to know if you're forever changed. I know you saw a kookaburra. I want to know how many kangaroos you saw. I want all the cliches.
I got them.
Okay.
I'm packing.
Did you bring us each a flat white?
No, it's no longer the flat white. Now it's the piccolo.
Oh.
Well, you mean that's the new coffee trend?
I mean, to the extent that the first time I went to Melbourne, I heard the words flat white for the first time in my life. This time I went back, ordered a flat white, and they certainly have them. But the new thing that was new to me, the coffee trend that was new to me, was the piccolo. I mean, has it reached these shores? I feel like I haven't encountered it.
No. What's a piccolo? I assume it's small in some way.
Is it like a cortado, but cortadoer?
It's cortado, or a version of the cortado, but it's instead of it being... It's a ristretto pull, I believe, and then very little milk. But if you can tell me the difference between an espresso and a ristretto, you're a better man than I.
All right, fantastic. Let's throw out Bob Dylan and David Lynch and just talk coffee all day.
All right. Also joining us, as you hear, back in Los Angeles is our beloved Julia Turner, a fellow at the Annenberg School of Journalism. Hey, Julia.
Hello.
And a note to listeners, if you hear any clanking in the background when I'm speaking, it's because it's in the 20s here in New York and my building radiator is clanking itself on. There's really nothing I can do about that background noise, so I apologize. All right, well, it's the big three back again. I'm so very happy to have both of you on the mic. So let's dig in. The director, James Mangold, is probably best known for the 2005 Johnny Cash biopic Walk the Line, which won Reese Witherspoon an Academy Award for Best Actress as June Carter Cash. But Mangold has made a lot of other films in his nearly 3-decade-long career, including Girl Interrupted, Copland, Ford v. Ferrari, and the 2 highly regarded X-Men installments, Wolverine and Logan. Now, Mangold is once again trying his hand at the musical biopic genre with A Complete Unknown, a film about Bob Dylan that's adapted from the book Dylan Goes Electric by Elijah Wald. This movie covers specifically the years from around 1961, when the 19-year-old Robert Zimmerman, soon to become Bob Dylan, moved to New York and began playing on the Greenwich Village folk club scene, through 1965, when he took his stardom to the next level and alienated a large chunk of his early fandom by going electric at the Newport Folk Festival. In this clip, you'll hear Timothée Chalamet as Bob Dylan and Monica Barbaro as Joan Baez. They're talking in her apartment after the first night they've spent together as she makes coffee and he sits on her bed, noodling on his guitar.
Who taught you to play?
Well, I taught myself, really. Picked up a few licks at the carnival.
At the carnival.
Oh yeah, they was singing cowboys that come through, teach me all sorts of funny chords. And they passed through in the shows in Kansas or Dakotas. Yeah, these chords I learned from a cowboy named Wigglefoot.
You were in a carnival. You are so completely full of shit.
All right. I'm torn who to start with here because I suspect / know that Steve is probably more of a Bob Dylanologist than Julia is. And in a way, Julia, that makes me want to start with you because I wonder how this movie lands with somebody who doesn't come in with maybe a lot of historical baggage about Bob Dylan, who maybe just knows him as a singer-songwriter and not as much as a biographical figure. So yes, to you I turn, Julia. What do you think of A Complete Unknown?
I was stunned to find that I loved this movie. I thought this was like just a very, very well-made movie. I felt so happy in its confident, sure-footed, handsome, thoughtful, like craftsmanship. And I think we need to come back around to the Chalamet performance, which is unlike anything I've ever seen him do and pretty great. And I'm curious to think about the mechanics of that and why it is so good. The supporting performances are great too. Monica Barbaro, last scene driving, like flying an F whatever in Top Gun Maverick. She was like the girl pilot. Is pretty great here. And particularly Ed Norton as Pete Seeger is a really wonderful performance too. I guess I left thinking, is a handsome, well-crafted, pretty straightforward movie actually the right way to tell the story of Bob Dylan? Like in a way, the kind of shape-shifting avant-garde approach of something like I'm Not There seems perhaps more in tune. But I think this movie is actually kind of making an argument about Dylan as a freewheeling craftsman that maybe makes it a good fit. I'm dying to know what you guys thought.
Yeah. All right, Steve. Now I turn to you. And am I wrong in thinking that you're somewhat of a Dylanologist? Surely you've read at least one book about or by Bob Dylan in your life, no?
By the way, I read the Dylan.
Oh, you did? The Chronicles?
Yeah, FYI.
But not to scorn Julia's background. I just don't think of you as like a big,
I'm going to reveal
rock history
vast
woman.
swaths of cultural ignorance later in this show, and we'll get to it. But I actually do know a little bit about Dylan. But I also want to know what Steve thinks about this.
Well, I have a funny relationship to Bob Dylan. I'm not an idolizer of Dylan, not in the same way I'm an idolizer of Tom Waits or Leonard Cohen or even Neil Young. Like Dylan is the originator, right? And I think the movie hints at this in ways that I think are quite tasteful. It doesn't lard it up with a lot of mythology, but the fact that Dylan wrote his own songs is among the radical things that he did. I mean, he opened up an entire space for making music that we still all occupy. I got a lot of shit once for saying that Dylan originated in his own way hip hop. All I meant by that was the idea that the person vocalizing is also the writer. That's traceable to Dylan. The album is a coherent, integrated, singular project that totally transcends the individual songs. That's down to Dylan. Dylan's influence on John Lennon, which turns the Beatles into the Beatles, then returns to Dylan in his impulse to be a rock star. Now, I should say that impulse preceded the Beatles. He wanted to be Elvis when he was younger. He idolized Little Richard. The movie's also quite shrewd about this. I mean, it says that from the beginning, Dylan saw folk music maybe not as a stepping stone. I don't know that he was that cynical and kind of tactical in his thinking, but he definitely all along wanted to get a bigger sound, wanted to be on the radio, and wanted to be a rock star. Like everyone who saw Elvis of that generation who saw Elvis on Ed Sullivan. Yet I don't have a singular obsession with Dylan. I've actually never read anything by Dylan. I haven't read the Chronicles books. I'm mostly uninterested in Dylan biographies. I think I have to read one eventually. I do listen to his music, but not obsessively. I kind of partially side with Joni Mitchell, who loves puncturing holes in this gigantic reputation that's gotten too big in some sense. So all of which is to say, I went into the movie with a towering respect for Bob Dylan's place in music history, a love and adoration for his best music, a relative indifference and even hostility to the mythology. And so I was very interested to see what that weird mix would make of whatever peculiar mix the movie was. And what I come away with is I admire the movie, and I'm curious to know whether you agree with me for being very, very frank, very candid about what a sphinx Dylan is, and if you're being less charitable, and I think the movie verges on being less charitable, what a cipher Bob Dylan the person is. And in that sense, the movie is substantially about this almost Amadeus-like lack of a relationship between the person and the genius, between the person and the music, between the person and the songs. He's just a machine for kind of wandering through life in a kind of ambling, kind of a incoherently shambling and rambling way as a human being, and from it getting little pieces, little threads of raw material from everything he sees and weaving them into these extraordinary songs that appear to come kind of from nowhere in some sense. And I think that honoring that mystery allowed them to appropriately mythologize the originality and the power of the songs without especially mythologizing and maybe even totally demythologizing the person. And I thought that was interesting. I have a ton more to say about what the arc from folk music to rock star is, about the various ancillary performances, which I think are extraordinary. But Dana, I really want to hear what you thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think I did not go in with high expectations from this documentary. In some ways, I mean, not even having to do with Chalamet or Mangold or anybody who's in on making it. It also, I should have mentioned earlier, is co-written by Jay Cox, who's a sort of legendary screenwriter who's worked with Scorsese in the past, wrote The Age of Innocence. I had no qualms about sort of the pedigrees of the people who made it, but it's just the music biopic, particularly of somebody of this level, right, of fame and you know, with this amount of legend accumulated around them, seems like a fairly hopeless genre. It's really, really hard to make something that doesn't feel like cosplaying, you know, that doesn't feel like impersonation and, oh, I have the correct costume on and I'm singing the song sort of well. I mean, just by its very essence, the idea of taking a performer and making them recreate the, by definition, impossible to recreate charisma of a different performer just very rarely works. And just last year alone, we had an Amy Winehouse biopic that we didn't discuss on this show for good reason, because it was utterly leaden, called Back to Black. And then the Maria Callas biopic that Angelina Jolie just acted in, which we may end up talking about at some point, but which I also think is kind of a complete failure, both as a tribute to Callas and just as a piece of, you know, as a dramatic story. And like Julia, I was surprisingly charmed and kind of blown away by just what a good movie this is, how full of good character arcs it is, how whether or not the version of Dylan that Chalamet plays is convincing or not, just what an interesting figure he is on screen. I think as much as a movie about Dylan, this is a movie about fame and about what it is to be adjacent to fame. And there's a repeated scene that keeps happening over and over again in the movie, sometimes with the women who are interested in him, like the Joan Baez character and Sylvie Russo, who's a sort of fictionalized version of Dylan's real life girlfriend, Susie Rotolo, played by Elle Fanning, but also sometimes the men who are watching him perform, like the guy who becomes his manager later, or, you know, Pete Seeger, played by Edward Norton. There's this recurring scene of people standing off in the wings or in the audience watching him perform at this very early stage of his career and sort of realizing what they're seeing, realizing that they're seeing this world-changing talent who's going to sort of transform popular music, and kind of weighing that against, for example, what kind of performer am I? You know, if it's a performer who's watching him, or for the manager guy, you know, what can I make of this? How can I turn this into my fortune? And for Pete Seeger, what is this going to mean for the world of folk music that, you know, is such an important sort of archive that I'm trying to guard for the future, right? So it's always about what Dylan means for the people watching him in a way more than what's going on within the performer himself. And I thought that was such an interesting way to approach making a movie about this famously hard to know person.
The thing that's amazing, though, is that I actually think the movie is very smart and sort of being about his unknowability. I mean, the title is not an accident, a complete unknown. It's the question of the movie is sort of, is there a there, and who was that guy, and what comes of the people who try to know him? On the other hand, I think it wouldn't be satisfying, and the Chalamet performance wouldn't be satisfying if the answer was like, well, it's just a black hole of mystery. Like, I think, and in a way, I wonder if the secret of Chalamet's ability to embody this charisma is his own charisma. It's like charisma shape-shifting. Like, I think we've discussed this, Dana, on mic, certainly off, that Chalamet is one of those performers that when you see him, you often think like, there's that Chalamet kid doing something great. Like in Dune, he's kind of like charming and wispy and seems like Timmy. And in Wonka, he kicks up his heels and does a few more jigs, but he still kind of seems like, what if Timmy was Willy Wonka? And this is really one of his first performances where I didn't think the whole time, look, it's Timmy doing Dylan. I really kind of got lost and began to believe this version of Dylan. And I think the film gives this arc of his reverence for folk music. The film opens with him seeking out a ill and impaired Woody Guthrie and explaining to him how he was knocked to the ground by his music. And then he says, I like your songs too, Pete. in a beautiful...
Poor Pete Pete Seeger.
Beautiful and beautifully played, faint praise moment. His admiration for that kind of music is sincere, but part of the movie is him realizing he has to kind of kill his mentors, or that he the question is, what do you owe to the people who believed in you initially and saw a version of your talents and lifted you up? Do you owe it to them to be what they saw in you forever, or can you keep being whatever it is you see or are interested in yourself? And we see glimpses of that in him. It's not quite so literal as all of that, but I found in the performance a satisfyingly, he's a mystery to himself. He doesn't quite know why he's doing this, but he feels this pull to do it. And I think actually the way the film plays the relationships with both of the major women help tell the story. There's a moment where he kind of goes back to the Sylvie character when he's about to make this big transition, and he does it in kind of a thoughtless way. But it seems like he's trying to get to some of those questions. And I don't know, it worked for me. Like it didn't feel like it was just like, he's a space alien, he landed from the sky, and then he changed music and everyone was like, whoa. I felt like there was a person in there, and I felt that it was a believable arc.
Yeah, I think it feels like there's a person in there, and specifically a person who's at a moment of self-reinvention. There's some moments where, well, even like the moment we heard the audio clip from, of him making up this obviously fake story that he learned to play music from carnival barkers.
I learned everything I know about podcasting from a clown named Wigglefoot, actually, as it happens.
But the sense of playfulness in that scene, and the sense that he is pushing to see how far he can make up a bald-faced lie in front of Joan Baez. I think there's a person there. This isn't about the interiority, the deep interiority of Bob Dylan, but you're right, Julie. It also doesn't make him into, just a sort of mysterious cipher who could never possibly be plumbed.
Perhaps he's not a mysterious cipher. I read the film somewhat differently than you guys. But I think what the movie does argue, and quite explicitly or show quite convincingly, is that if someone creates an immensity out of their own imagination, to then turn to the person and try to find the source of it in them as a physical, present, individual human being, you're making a category error. And what the movie not only demonstrates is the nature of that category error, but what it's like to live that category error as Bob Dylan, this slender little kid from Minnesota, from Hibbing, Minnesota, goes from being a nobody to being like everything, like the biggest genius since Shakespeare, the creator. I mean, that song, Like a Rolling Stone, in the movie is depicted, I think, quite accurately as a song that gave birth to a generational self-consciousness, right? Like, you are the white oracle of Black suffering. I mean, all of these things suddenly get imputed to a human being who can't possibly withstand them, like not just the music, but everything the music implies. So in that sense, I think the movie's quite wise about that. Before we go, there are two scenes I really wanted to point to really quickly. One is that there's a tiny moment where he's at a civil rights march, courtesy really of his girlfriend who's committed to the cause. Dylan's portrayed as ignorant of it. But he goes, and what he sees in that moment, the movie clearly depicts what he sees, is how electric and alive the crowd is to the speaker, a Black male speaker. And there's a suggestion, I think, that Dylan is not cynical about civil rights or the cause of Black exploitation and disenfranchisement and Jim Crow. Not at all. The movie's not cynical about Dylan being that cynical, but he definitely sees that there's something, an energy there that can be turned to his own artistic advantage. And then the second one was, there's a moment of extraordinary pathos where he turns, I believe it's to Joan Baez, but I can't remember if it's to his other girlfriend, where he says, when people look at me, do you remember this moment? He says, people look at me when they hear the songs, and it's not that they wonder how I wrote them. It's that they wonder why they didn't write them.
Right. It's not that they're wondering where the songs come from. It's wondering why they didn't come to them.
Right. And he, imagine bearing the burden of saying for everyone else more beautifully and more meaningfully everything they're already feeling. There's a way in which Dylan is very shrewd about that. He's like, but deep down you hate me for it, right? I mean, deep down you might devour me for it. And maybe that need to be in constant motion, to be constantly waltzing away from the human being we thought he was a way of escaping that impulse of retribution. I mean, I'm saying it in a complicated way, but people hate their idols and turn on them. And I think maybe at some level, Dylan understood that.
Yeah. Well, and it starts with him turning on his idols too. I also just have to say, my husband and I took our 11-year-old sons to this, and it's a great multi-generational movie. I mean, they're both really interested in history and music, and we've taken them to see other music docs and things like that. I don't know if they've seen a biopic yet. And they just loved it. And the renderings of the songs, which are all sung by the performers and which were recorded in the room, Mangold has given a bunch of interviews about. They're not like, sometimes in musicals, you can tell that they're lip syncing to a beautiful studio track. There's an authenticity to the way the songs are performed and captured in the film, which I think is part of its power. And it was just so fun to see them really hear these pretty good versions of these really great songs and get kind of blown away. So just as a little like musical education piece for the kiddos, it was a real treat to see it with them in that way.
I'm glad you highlighted that, Julia, because something I wanted to say before we wrap the segment is that the thing I like best about this movie, maybe best of all, is that it respects the music of Bob Dylan and presents songs in their entirety, not just, as you say, well sung and, sung live on set by the performers, but not just little clips of songs. And it's so often that the music biopic, in fact, the Amy Winehouse pick does this, will take a very famous song that everyone knows and show that performer, writing it in their bedroom or performing it at a club or something. But it just shows you a little minute of it in order to prove, like, here they are singing the song. Here are people reacting to it in awe. And there's not an actual moment spent with the song. Like, let's listen to what a great song Positively 4th Street is, or whatever the song is. And this movie really does that, so that even as somebody who's very familiar with these songs, and it strikes me from our conversation that I may be the biggest Bob Dylan fan of the three of us in terms of just how often I put on his music and how much it's meant to me at different phases of my life. But even as somebody who knew these songs very well in their original sung by Bob Dylan version, I walked around for days afterwards just thinking about the lyrics and thinking about what great songs they are. So I can see why, to young viewers like your sons, it might be a great entryway to Bob Dylan, even though it doesn't contain a word sung by him. All right. Well, the film is a complete unknown. It's in theaters only right now. And yeah, if you're at all interested in Dylan or the art of the music biopic, I'd say I would recommend it.
Oh, where have you been, my blue-eyed son? Oh, where have you been, my darling young one? I stumbled on the side of 12 misty mountains. I walked and I crawled on 6 crooked highways.
It's a new year, and that means a new opportunity to reimagine your wardrobe. This year, resolve to refresh your look with quality pieces while staying on budget with Quince. Steve, I love when Quince wants to advertise on weeks when we're both on the show because I know you're a big fan, as I am, of their products. Can you talk up your latest favorite Quince acquisition?
Absolutely. So before I went to Australia, I said I'd ordered a pair of Cool Max chinos, but I really hadn't had a chance to extensively road test them. But the idea was a kind of lightweight, very breathable pant for the reversed seasons of Australia. Man, these things outperformed my highest expectations. They're so incredibly comfy. You could wear them out to a nice dinner. You could wear them on a rough hike. I did both. They held up beautifully, popped out of the wash nice and new looking and clean. Quince just makes very high quality clothes that I've been happy with every single time.
Absolutely. Yeah. The few Quince things I have are like outfit defining pieces, right? It's like this one great silk shirt and you can just pop it on over everything and you look chic. Upgrade your closet this year without the upgraded price tag. Go to quince.com/culture for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/culture to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/culture. Here's a little tip for all the music fans out there. Discover is accepted at 99% of places that take credit cards nationwide. You heard right, 99%. And every time you make a purchase with your card, you automatically earn cash back, which means you could earn rewards for those almost front row seats, ride shares to the venue, even that concert merch you've had your eye on since it dropped. If all of that sounds like music to your ears, remember, it pays to discover. Based on the February 2024 Nielsen report, learn more at discover.com/credit card. On Call is a new half-hour-long police drama, unusual length for a film of its kind, streaming on Amazon Prime. It's executive produced by Law & Order creator Dick Wolf, and it's created by his son Elliot Wolf, along with Tim Walsh. The show follows a pair of cops on the Long Beach police force. One is a young male rookie, one a more experienced female officer. The format is slightly unusual for a police procedural, not just because of the length, but because there's a convention by which each episode shows us a single shift the two partners are working together. Both cops wear body cameras, so during action scenes, we sometimes cut away to the footage they're capturing on these body cams as they move. It's a very swiftly paced show. Let's listen to a little bit of the show's trailer to get a sense of the mood. You'll hear the voices of Troyan Belisario as the veteran officer Tracy Harmon and Brandon Laracuente as her young trainee, Alex Diaz.
We think we know what this job is.
Help! Officer down, officer down!
Until we get that one call. Rocket fuel. How'd you do at the academy?
Second in my class.
Out of how many?
3.
You know I'm big on effort. But if you give me effort, I can teach you the rest.
Got you.
Narcotics unit requesting backup.
Diaz, what's your 20?
Drop the hatchet! Don't do it!
All right, Julia, this time I'm starting with you because you're our Law and Order lady. I know that's your comfort show, and you've watched many of its spinoffs for years as well. You were the one who was curious about what's going on with this new Dick Wolf exec produced show. So what's your 20? What'd you think of On Call?
Well, first I have to share that I watched this on the plane returning from New York back to Los Angeles. And also on the plane with me was Ilana de la Garza, the actress who plays Connie Rubirosa in the Law and Order universe. And I gather from Wikipedia-ing also has found a permanent home as some kind of character in the new FBI universe. And she was very nice, both to my daughter in the security line and to me hopping around with crutches on the plane. I don't think we've told our listeners that I'm currently on crutches. I am. I'm fine. Anyway, it felt funny to watch this, 8 feet on the plane from a true icon of the Law and Order universe. But anyway, props to Ilana de la Garza for being nice. So I was curious about this for a couple of reasons. The longevity of Dick Wolf and the Dick Wolf universe is insane. And if you're just a Law and Order person, that you may not have noticed that he also has the whole Chicago universe and then also the whole FBI universe. He currently has like 10 procedurals on the air. And they are very mechanically effective, and I haven't fallen into the Chicago and FBI ones, although I suppose I could, and there would go the rest of my time for the rest of my days. But I was curious about this because the notion of making the jump to streaming as a revolutionary thing for the Dick Wolf empire to do is kind of funny. Like the jump to streaming happened already. It happened like 6 years ago. And then they all started running all the same stuff. And then there was a strike, and then there was a contraction. And, the company is sort of framing this as like a revolutionary jump toward the future. But what actually is happening is that the streamers are going toward the past, right? The streamers are like, oh, you know what? People like to watch Dick Wolf procedurals. Why don't we try one of those in addition to whatever niche avant-garde, whatever the heck else we're putting on our streaming platform? So the framing is interesting. Structurally, what's interesting is the half-hour format. The notion of doing one of these shows in a half hour is fascinating. And then I think because of the streaming and thus bingeable nature, it sounds like they got a little bit of push to have a slightly more serialized plot than a lot of the Dick Wolf shows do. That they tend to really focus on the case of the week and have sort of a light smattering of serial plot, but not too much. This show completely worked for me as a plane watch for a couple of reasons. In part because of that pace of everything being a little bit tauter and tighter. In part because if you're accustomed to watching the detective shows, and I assume if you're a fan of the Chicago shows, you have probably they operate more in this style. Usually in the detective shows, there's like 3 minutes where they're chasing a guy down an alley. This show is like, what if the whole show was the chase down the alley? Like they go down the alley and then they go into another alley and then they go to a port and then they go to an office building and they're never not sort of chasing a guy. So it has kind of a frenetic pace. And then I thought the relationship between the training officer and her rookie and the serialization of the evolution of that relationship, was not a Shakespearean level of rich characterization, but like developed in a more focused way than those partnerships sometimes develop on the main shows. But I also kind of feel like I just put you guys in a lab experiment because I feel that there's no way you would have watched the show in your own lives. So I'm very curious what you made of it. And I think it'll be interesting to get to, Dick Wolf's empire for years has been criticized for being propaganda. It's been interesting to watch the evolution of how those shows talk about policing. This show really set on patrol goes right to the heart of that, and I think tries to surface some questions about the role of police and what it's like to be a police officer these days, and also what kinds of people become police officers these days, sometimes in ways that have some texture to them and sometimes in ways that seem pretty blunt.
Yeah, I have lots to say about that. But first, I want to hear, Steve, what was your basic reaction to the show? And you weren't on a plane, so you don't get that upgrade in quality that a captive audience gains.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem for us more almost like an entertainment business story or angle than a show itself. Like, it's not only that, Dana, you and I wouldn't have watched this. We probably wouldn't talk about it if it weren't for the shrinking to a half hour, Dick Wolf going to streaming, the kind of alibi of, this is a forward-looking thing on the part of Dick Wolf and company, when really it's the backward glance of the streaming business towards network formats. I mean, it's compared to like throwing 1,000 strands of spaghetti at the wall and waiting to see which one sticks, and it happens to be baby reindeer, like as a business model, that just seems maybe to no longer be attractive to either the streamers or the Wall Street flunkies that they need to impress on a quarterly basis. So what do you want? You want, what is Dick Wolf TV? And I say this is a huge fan of the comfort watch of Law and Order, but it's just formulaic, highly generic, predictable, and comfort watch and standalone, right? So you can catch anyone in syndication or whatever, and it doesn't matter. And so the show itself, what interested me about the show was first of all, it is very, very well done. It's taut, it's streamlined, it's all the dumb critical adjectives that have been thrown at it. They happen to be true in this case. It's well written, it's well acted, it's well directed. I think the two principals are tremendously good, especially Troyan Belisario. I hope I'm saying her name right, as Harmon, as the sort of rule follower and the senior partner. I actually think she's terrific, and I think the writing is quite good. It gets at their respective characters, she and the rookie cops, their respective characters very quickly and convincingly. But it did keep occurring to me, is this comfort TV or discomfort TV? I was very confused by that. It has a kind of tension and street level grit and kind of naturalistic attention, or would-be naturalistic attention, to social decay that keeps it from being the comfort TV of Law and Order. And is now the time to be lionizing cops even a little bit? The show, I think, tries to have that both ways, and it tries to have, whether it's comforting viewing or like peak TV, challenging, gritty, discomfort TV. These things seem ill worked out in the context of something that otherwise is actually quite nicely delivered. But Dana, what'd you think?
Yeah, I mean, to touch on the propaganda angle, right? I don't think that I have a strong opinion about whether the retro style shows like SVU and Law and Order function as, sort of advertisements for the use of force in policing, et cetera, because they are so old school and formulaic and almost Perry Mason-like, in their structure, that it seems like that question can only be applied to them retroactively, right? They would not have even asked that question at the time of first formulating those shows. But now in 2024, to go back to some version of that format and sort of snazz it up for the new world of streaming, I think that some of those oversights become more glaring. And I mean, I'm thinking in particular about how, at least so far, I'm halfway through. I've watched 4 episodes of the 8 episodes per season, and the bad guys are all just so bad. I mean, one of the reviews we read of the show was kind of wisecracking on this a bit, in that one of the main, baddie that they're pursuing, who is responsible for this police murder that happens in the first episode, is called Maniac. That's his name. And we don't learn much about Maniac, except that he is a maniac and he is bad. And more disturbingly still, there's an episode, I think it's the 2nd or 3rd episode of the season, where the cops raid a homeless encampment, right? And the raid of this place full of unhoused people is completely framed as something that's dangerous for the cops. And without giving away, I don't want to spoil the suspense of this scene, but something happens in this scene that is essentially a brutal attack on a cop by a homeless person, which then, we have to worry about, is that cop okay? And it just seems like in this particular moment of history, to have a Los Angeles homeless encampment and have the big suspense scene set there be about the scary homeless people who might do something bad to the cops is just not a good look.
Yeah, it's interesting in general, the portrayal of Southern California. The show is set in Long Beach quite specifically, and I think that's an interesting place to set a show, and you begin to see the texture of it. Obviously, 8 half-hour episodes is not the same as 22, 40-some minute episodes, so you get a little bit less texture than you might. I actually think, though, and there is also a homeless person in an earlier homeless encampment scene who is like knows the cops, and they seem to have a beat cop relationship and is kind of a source about some things. And there are other scenes of them interacting more sensitively.
Julia, I don't mean to interrupt you, but can you give us just a brief description of the semiotics of Long Beach? I don't know what that means.
No, that's a great question, Steve. So Long Beach is a city. It's essentially the port city And it's a bit south of LA proper, but it's within LA County, which sort of operates as the city too, So like people in Long Beach have jobs all over LA, might be commuting to different places, or might have a life that's centered more closely in the South Bay. And in general, I think when you try to set a show in LA, quote unquote, you are probably biting off more than you can chew, and setting it in an enclave within LA County probably gives you a little bit more grist. They don't develop it too much, but it also means that some of the locations are not the super obvious ones. And, that there's a port plot line at one point that makes sense to be happening there. On the question of the propaganda stuff, I agree that sort of the way the crowds and ruffians are treated is broad and would merit development. But it's like a perfectly interesting question. Who becomes a cop these days, and how do they feel about being a cop in an environment where the police take much more criticism than they ever have before and are no longer considered like Mr. Rogers style helpers necessarily, even though, as the show depicts, they're regularly putting their lives on the line to, for the stated goal of producing public safety. And I think that's like interesting emotional terrain and intellectual terrain. And although this show is, not necessarily advancing particularly unusual ideas about it, I think the whole wolf empire has become savvier at navigating the complexities of our political reality across the shows that I watch. And so I think they handle that stuff pretty well. I'll also say Eric LaSalle is in this as kind of a old school cop. And he also directed a bunch of the episodes. And I'm curious what you guys thought of the direction. But in general, I thought it was pretty great. They're also in a car all the time. And it looks like they really are shooting in cars to me. Tell me if I've just been conned by very good fake car scenes. But it's, shooting in cars is not always, I think sometimes like a very telltale place where productions fall down. And I thought that the tautness that is frequently how the show is described, which maybe is what happens when you take a 42-minute show and put it in 30 minutes. But I feel like the action direction and the car, the way the show is directed, and several of the episodes are directed by Eric LaSalle, is pretty good.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's really tight. I think it's just tight, top to bottom, really tight. And that's on the director more than anyone.
Yeah, it moves along nicely. I can't say that I'm a huge fan of the writing of the show. I really feel after 4 episodes, like the characters are very slightly differentiated from one another, especially anybody who's not in that car, anybody who's not those 2 main cop partners. And this is not the kind of show I would stick with because, as you were saying, Julia, there's just a lot of chasing a guy and not a great deal of getting to know a guy who one is chasing or doing the chasing.
Well, Amazon doesn't release numbers, and it's not, they haven't announced to pick up for a second season yet. So it's, I think another interesting question is that although this seems like a pretty capable feint toward taking the Dick Wolf brand towards the streaming empire, I think it remains to be seen whether it's at least an economic success. So we will keep an eye on call and see how it does.
One thing I will say, it doesn't take long to figure out if you like it or not, because it does move very swiftly.
I watched the whole thing and was done before we even got to Nebraska.
This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Because Progressive offers discounts for paying in full, owning a home, and more. Plus, you can count on their great customer service to help you when you need it, so your dollar goes a long way. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save on car insurance. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states and situations.
If you're a facilities manager at a university, you know students rely on the cafeteria for breakfast, lunch, dinner, and the occasional late-night snack. So when a dishwasher breaks down and dirty plates pile up, the mess hall can turn messy in the blink of an eye. Enter Grainger. With over 1 million industrial-grade products and fast delivery, the product you need now is never far away. So you can turn that dishwasher back into a lean, clean washing machine. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
When David Lynch died from complications of emphysema last week at the age of 78, he left behind a sprawling and surprisingly varied body of work spanning 6 decades, from the cult horror of Eraserhead to the period drama of Elephant Man to neo-noir crime thrillers like Lost Highway and Mulholland Drive to the groundbreaking episodic television of Twin Peaks. There was no one genre or style associated with Lynch, but there was always a unifying vision, one so unique to this particular mind that very early in his career it gave rise to the adjective Lynchian.
You're like me. Oh, look at those. Oh, what are these? Don't say please, fuckhead! Oh, baby wants to pinch them. What's the matter? Give him back. What's the matter? They're just a little red, that's all. Let me feel them. Come here.
Hey, leave her alone!
For a film to be Lynchian meant it was subject to a peculiar logic all its own. Events connected not by the normal cause and effect relationships that drive movie plots, but by dreamlike leaps in logic that only over the course of a whole movie or sometimes several seasons of a TV show start to arrange themselves into patterns. He could make an ordinary suburban living room seem unbearably menacing, or make something as horrifying as a severed ear in the grass seem somehow funny. As Time magazine's Stephanie Zaharik wrote in a lovely tribute to Lynch last week, he made strange things seem normal and normal things feel strange. In honor of Lynch, we each watched a different movie over the weekend from his, as I say, extremely varied career. So we could all bring in sort of different aspects of who Lynch was to the culture and to us. Steve, what was the movie that you watched to talk about, and what in general has been your relationship to Lynch's work over your life?
So I rewatched Mulholland Drive, which I hadn't seen in, God, it could be 20 years. But I also rewatched Eraserhead and Blue Velvet for what it's worth. But my relationship to Lynch is basically as follows. I think Eraserhead came out in 1977, definitely in the late 70s. I was maybe a little on the young side to go to like the midnight showings where it was perpetually playing. But Eraserhead was just always there. It was this kind of object of culture. Whether you experienced it or not, you experienced it secondhand. It was always playing in art house movie theaters, weekend midnight showings, along with or alongside or right around Rocky Horror. And it had a certain status. And my experience of Lynch was slowly watching the guy who made this movie that I finally saw on VHS that floored me for its weirdness and unexpectedness, drifting kind of towards and away from the mainstream. I think there were 3 movies over the course of an incredible career. I think there were 3 movie-going experiences, importantly being in a full movie theater in the 80s, that changed me in a way. The first was Raiders of the Lost Ark, which was it was very hard to describe what it was like to see on a hot summer night in the air conditioning, a packed movie theater. You could barely find a seat. That Spielberg, along with Lucas, but principally Spielberg, had taken moviegoers someplace completely new in terms of thrills and unexpectedness within a kind of genre package. The third, I'll go in out of order. The third was Do the Right Thing in 1989. But in between was Blue Velvet. I really have never quite forgotten what it was like to see Blue Velvet in the theater. And here was Lynch, this, retrospectively, we can see he was keeping alive the ideal of the American auteur after the debacle of Heaven's Gate, which brought it to an end in a way in 1979, and the rise of Sundance Nation, that Lynch and obviously Spike Lee and a few others, notable ones, but almost principally Lynch was really keeping the idea of the director as a kind of highly distinctive, totally singular author alive. That said, I always had really mixed feelings about his movies. The sort of dreamlike, leaps in narrative logic or illogic, the highly surreal weirdnesses of them. I think one of the reasons Blue Velvet worked for me is that actually it's a very tight genre movie. Having just rewatched it, I was shocked at how sort of traditional and linear that movie is. And so the weirdness that gets packed into it lands in a different way than, for example, in Mulholland Drive. Mulholland Drive baffled me when I first saw it. It's a kind of highly surrealistic, highly nonlinear, dreamlike retelling, sort of homage in its oblique way to Sunset Boulevard. It's sort of a Hollywood story of dreams gone horrifically awry. On reviewing it, I now regard it as an absolute stone cold motherfucking soup to nuts masterpiece. I mean, that movie, now that I kind of get it, is so weird in its depiction of a world in which reality, dreams, fantasies, the movies, and psychosis have all started to leak into one another in these parallels, but also sort of phosphorescent ways, is astonishing. And in a weird way, the movie, it's one of those movies that's very hard to puzzle out just what happened, which is critical to the movie. That's important that that's what's going on in order to have the ultimate statement of the movie stand forth. You can't really reconstruct it as a linear X happened, therefore Y happened, therefore Z narrative. So it frustrates a lot of viewers. But one of the things I will say, it's one of the rare movies when you read a little bit about it and the way people have sort of talked and thought about what happens in the movie, it's not that it makes sense because there's no pat key that you turn that unlocks the whole movie that would destroy its effects. But you understand the like really wrenching pathos beneath the story of this woman played by Naomi Watts, who's on the periphery of Hollywood. And I won't say anything more. If you haven't seen it, you should see it. I will conclude by saying, as with the death of David Bowie, it brought home to me someone whose, creative output I thought didn't mean very much to me. It brought home to me the fact not only that it really does, but that belatedly I understand that they're a transformative genius. So anyway, but Julia, I'm dying to know, first of all, how did you never see anything by David Lynch? I just don't even understand how that's like possible. It's like never having heard the song Little Drummer Boy.
It's like never having shown your children The Wizard of Oz, which in my house, we still daily marvel over that fact, Julia.
We haven't remedied that yet either. We thought about it, but we didn't do it. The way that Lynch was described, so coming up in the 90s, like my development as a person who had her own independent film tastes was very Sundance 90s, right? Like, oh my gosh, Pulp Fiction. Wow. Don't I have great taste? And so I think the line on Lynch at that time was it's kind of creepy and it's kind of surreal, neither of which has ever been like, cool, that's my favorite thing. So I just never explored it. And I watched Blue Velvet last night, and we can come back around to what I made of it. But I think since I'm so ignorant, I'd rather start with where Dana, where Lynch fits into your pantheon, Dana, and how you have thought about his work over time and what his death means to you, before we get to my ignoramus eye view.
All right. Well, you're not sliding out of your analysis of Blue Velvet. I still want to hear it. I love that you're a newbie just experiencing that for the first time. I think my experiences probably comports with a person who grew up to become a film critic, in that, as I said on a recent episode of the Blank Check podcast, where we talked about The Straight Story. So if you want to hear me in very great detail on that movie, you can listen to the Blank Check podcast. But as I said on that show, although I've always seen every David Lynch movie as it comes out, because it's an event when there's a new David Lynch movie, I would never consider him one of my guys exactly. And that might be, Julia, because like you, my first interest is not, disquieting horror and the kind of strange sensations that his movies tend to evoke. But he's always been a filmmaker that I admire and am curious about, and occasionally love his movies, but would not put any of them in my pantheon of most special to me kind of films. The one place that there is, and I realized this on looking at his filmography after he died, the one place there is a hole in my Lynch viewing is his TV, honestly. I watched the first season of Twin Peaks, and not the second. And I think that may in part have been because I think maybe I lived in an apartment without a TV when that second season was on. And because I had never seen the second season, I never saw Firewalk with Me, his Twin Peaks spin-off movie. And because I hadn't seen those two, I never watched Twin Peaks: The Return, this, fairly recent revival of the show that he did, which is apparently a masterpiece. And maybe this just goes to me not being a huge serialized TV person, but that is a big hole in my Lynch knowledge. I don't really get references to that show beyond the first season, and I don't know all the places that he took it. It is very interesting that he chose to return to that universe. But that balance between a serialized type of narrative and something that's a more one and done movie narrative is actually present in Mulholland Drive as well. I mean, part of why Mulholland Drive is so hard to figure out, I think, Steve, is that it was originally meant to be a TV show. And when that deal sort of fell apart, he essentially repurposed the TV show into a movie. And I feel like, as much as I love Mulholland Drive, that you can see some of those lumps and bumps when you watch it, that there are parts of it that aren't resolved, not just because of dreamlike leaps in logic that were purposeful, but because of narrative arcs that weren't developed as they would have been had it actually become a show. But all of that said, yeah, I think maybe, Steve, like you, I started to put together a bit more upon looking at the response, the very, very moving response online to his death last week. Which included, for example, many, many trans and queer writers saying that he had been so important to them, as a filmmaker because of his interest in transformation, precisely, not necessarily, gender-related transformation, although that sometimes too, as there's a famous trans character in that one of the seasons of Twin Peaks that I didn't watch. But because, his movies are just all about things that can become something else, that can enter a different kind of universe than the one that they started out in. And you might never quite understand why or be able to trace the logic of it. You have to sort of just trust in the transformation. And it's just very powerful that somebody who is interested in something as avant-garde as that. And if you think of a movie like Lost Highway, I don't know if you've seen that one, Steve, but it really is kind of avant-garde in what it does to the expected kind of noir narrative that you think you're setting off on. The fact that somebody like that could become a household name is really sort of extraordinary. It just speaks to, it even made me think of our Dylan conversation from earlier in the show, that once in a while this talent emerges out of nowhere who does something only they could do, and then they create an appetite for that thing that only they could do, right? That they create an appetite for the Lynchian where there was nothing there before.
Yeah. I mean, seeing Blue Velvet, so I watched Blue Velvet last night. There's so much to love and admire about it. And even just seeing the baby Kyle MacLachlan, who posted a beautiful and moving Instagram post about what Lynch meant to him and then wrote about him for the New York Times movingly as well. Sort of what Lynch does with this like baby puppy performer and the sort of strange Boy Scout eagerness of him as he advances his extremely weird ideas about what to do with his like he sort of follows curiosity around absurd corners that you wouldn't think would be where a character with his general mien and affect would go, is super compelling. And it's true that sort of that structurally it's somewhat conventional. I think there's a mannered quality to the performances that is doing something unusual. And I just watching it, I began to kind of zoom out and think about like, what is surrealism for? Like, what is happening to us when artists go to the realm of the uncanny and try to confront strangeness? And I thought of two movies we saw this year or in the last year. I thought of both Ramel Ross's direction and Nickel Boys, which we saw while you were out, Steve, and which I think you should definitely go try to see in the theater if you can, now that you're back. Like, it's just such an interesting film. I think you'd really respond to it. But the director of that film, Ramel Ross, has spoken about reaching for the epic banal, like trying to film strange little moments like a deck of cards shuffling or like, dust motes and sort of marvel at them, use the power of cinema to marvel at the normal and make it strange and fresh and give you the perspective of seeing. There's like a quality of that. And then the substance is one gigantic Lynch homage, which I didn't understand in quite as like literal a way until I spent a little bit more time with Lynch's work. You know, I had a funny reaction when he died of feeling very sad about losing him as a figure, even though I don't have a relationship to the work. And I think that's in part because he always seemed like a benevolent figure. And he did play this really funny role in Los Angeles where during the pandemic, a few months into the pandemic, he started reading the weather on KCRW, one of our local public radio stations, and also posting them to YouTube. And he would do this morning weather report.
Good morning. It's June 11, 2020, and it's a Thursday.
And it was sort of so perfect and strange, and in a way made you think about how the pandemic was a time of the uncanny. It was like a moment where reality seemed bent and normalcy was thrown out the window.
Beautiful blue skies, golden sunshine, very still right now, except for a bee in here.
And the notion of Lynch sort of rising to that occasion and both trying to provide normalcy and lean into the uncanniness of the moment by giving the weather report. And of course, the point of the weather report was sort of that it's always sunny in Los Angeles. Like he was describing, I mean, all his full, you can watch all of his weather reports as a playlist on YouTube, and it's kind of funny to go check that out. And of course, he had this interest in transcendental meditation, which again is, you know, in some ways seems at odds with the strangeness and darkness of his work, in that it's calming and centering to meditate, but in a way it also seems aligned with it, because part of what that is about is recentering your own presence of experience. And in a way, it seems like the uncanny in his work is trying to confront you with the shock of existence, like remind you that you exist and that existing is crazy. I think I was not a Lynch guy and probably won't be a Lynch guy, but I am glad to have spent a little time in his brain.
Julia, just to pick up on a word that you use, I think uncanny is just absolutely right. And often because his performers, his actors are giving highly affected, almost off-puttingly affected or non-natural performances, Mulholland Drive, there's an extraordinary moment when Mulholland Drive goes from the TV movie that Dana was pointing to the movie that Lynch reconceived it as, where Naomi Watts, who's been highly affected and kind of sunny and sort of in her own way kind of blank through a lot of the movie to that point, goes to an audition. Dana, you remember this scene in Mulholland Drive? And all of a sudden, Naomi Watts, all of the naturalistic ferocity and grief of Naomi Watts as an actress is brought to the surface in the audition. And that's among many things that's accomplished in that scene, is it tells you that Lynch knows absolutely that this is what his actors are doing, that they're doing it intentionally within the context of his vision, because in this highly artificial movie audition, suddenly an actress is, I mean, she gives an incredible, I cannot even begin to describe to you how powerful that scene is, you know, where Watts just does some of the greatest acting Watts has ever done in a situation where she's acting, an actress acting. And so Lynch is there before we are on all of this in ways that I don't think I appreciated until I rewatched his movies.
Yeah, Mulholland Drive is so much of a film about performance and artifice, right? That almost everything you say about it, the movie already understands. It's one of those movies that contains its own exegesis in a really brilliant way. I will never forget, and I posted about this upon hearing about Lynch, the conversation at dinner that my boyfriend at the time and the two friends that we saw Mulholland Drive with had. Just four people going out for dinner after seeing Mulholland Drive for the first time. We talked about nothing else the entire meal. We weren't arguing about it exactly. We were sort of attempting to arrive at a grand unifying theory of what we had seen. And it was just so invigorating and so different from your average movie conversation where there's two or three different interpretations at most that people can argue about. There was just such a kind of infinity of meaning to it. And I think Lynch brought that to people, and so that makes me understand why, for example, the Bob's Big Boy in Los Angeles currently has a David Lynch shrine that people are just spontaneously contributing to, because of course that was a place he loved to film in his movies and apparently hang out as well. Also, as on the transcendental meditation tip, I wanted to say, Julia, that actually the day after he died, or a couple days after, I participated in a worldwide meditation event because a friend who loved Lynch just texted me saying, there's a worldwide transcendental meditation happening in honor of David Lynch starting in 1 minute. Can you do it?
I
turned off everything I was doing.
I tried to join that Zoom, but the Zoom was full.
Oh, I didn't join a Zoom. I just turned off everything I was doing and sat on the floor for 10 minutes.
Oh, well, yes, I did a version of that too, but there apparently was a Zoom on which you could do that, which was would have been interesting to join.
Anyway, I love the idea that there was this sort of worldwide, not just fandom, but a sort of, David Lynch loving community that was mobilized after he was gone to do their own kind of creative work. And I think the way that people have been paying tribute to him online has largely been to say, thank you for being the weirdo that you are and letting yourself live inside your own strange mind, because maybe it liberates others to do that as well. All right. Well, David Lynch, his filmography and his TVography is out there to be watched. If it meant a lot to any of you, please write us at culturefest@slate.com and tell us your David Lynch stories.
She wore blue velvet, bluer than velvet was the night, softer than satin was the light from the stars.
Hello, Slate listeners. This is Felix Salmon from Slate Money. I'm sure you've been seeing the headlines from Los Angeles, the wildfires there, the insurance situation there, the prisoners working on the ground as firefighters. So, what's really happening, and what are the implications of all of this? We just had an episode of Slate Money. It's called The Dire Costs of the LA Fires. My co-hosts Emily Peck and Elizabeth Spires and I talk through questions like why people are so fixated on the celebrity homes that have been destroyed.
I think people are focusing on celebrities right now, partly because the bigger macro problems are really overwhelming and terrifying.
Where California needs to go from here, and how we should be thinking about the use of inmates as firefighters, and whether this choice given to inmates is really a choice at all.
It's an offer you can't refuse.
Listen to The Dire Costs of the LA Fires on Slate Money today.
All right, Julia, it's the moment in our show where we talk about the business. What do we have this week?
I just want to tell listeners about our Slate Plus bonus episode today. We're answering a listener question about electrifying cultural experiences, including, in my case, the time that the power of Tim Burton actually changed the weather in suburban Massachusetts. So stick around for that after the show if you are a member. If you're not, what's up? Why aren't you? Come on. It's time to become a Slate Plus member. You can sign up today at slate.com/cultureplus. Members get ad-free podcasts and lots of bonus content like the Plus segment I just mentioned. You can also hear members-only programming on other Slate shows like Slow Burn and the Political Gabfest, and unlimited access to all the great writing on slate.com. You'll never hit a paywall if you're a Slate Plus member. And of course, you'll support our work and the work of our colleagues. These memberships are super valuable to Slate, so sign up today at slate.com/cultureplus. Again, that's slate.com/cultureplus, or subscribe now on Apple Podcasts by clicking Try Free at the top of our show page.
It's that time in our show when we endorse what was your big cultural event this week, Steve. I'm going to start with you because you're fresh from the plane from Australia. So I'm hoping you're going to regale us now with some down under stories.
There's just too many feeling. I mean, imagine being stuck on the bottom of the earth, the literal antipodal, maximally distanced point from the United States in the waning days of the Republic, and how that would start to get in your head. The attractiveness of living at a maximal different distance from the chaos and suffering that we're all about to experience, mingling with the immense charms of Australia. So two very quick Australia-related endorsements. One is, if you've never read The Fatal Shore by Robert Hughes was the great Australian art critic who ended up in America and was Time Magazine's art critic for a long time. One of those last of the real true critical giants who strode the earth. He, as an Australian, he wrote a history of Australia, and it was meant as a corrective to the idea that Australian history was the history of achieving respectability out of the penal origins, a corrective because the penal origins got kind of a diminished or all but memory hold in relation to that striving for respectability. And in fact, it's the history of Auschwitz in many ways, Auschwitz and plantation-like conditions in early Australia. I mean, a country in no small part, not only built as a prison penal colony and exclusively as a penal colony. It was a forbidding, faraway place. It wasn't attractive strategically or in itself the way, for example, New Zealand, which was quite green and temperate, was to the colonial British. It was literally to get rid of the human refuse of the supposedly criminal underclass. He explores that so beautifully and in all its dimensions, including the brutal destruction, near genocide of the Aborigines, all of it done with an enormous amount of literary flair, restraint, taste, and moral empathy. It's an extraordinary work of literature. It is really, truly one of the best nonfiction books ever written. I really believe that. But not only was it a penal colony, it was a slave colony. Then it essentially it became economically viable and effectively, in the end, its own nation, because of the free labor of and coerced labor of the prisoners. Anyway, it's an extraordinary book. I can't recommend it highly enough. If you are an Australian head at all, you know that, like Lennon and McCartney and Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and all the other facile dyads that I'm completely in love with, Mozart and Beethoven, Melbourne and Sydney, the two major cities of Australia, have this kind of dynamic competitive tension between the two of them. You tend to be a fan of one or not the other. I won't go into all the specifics of it. Let me say that I returned from this trip like a fan of the Beatles. I love John and Paul. Like I love Melbourne. It's so instinctively the kind of city that I love. A coffee, laid back. We're the culturistas city. Sydney is the striver city, to be facile about it. It's also like San Diego and LA and Miami, just very much a beach city. I really fell in love with Sydney. And especially, I found a neighborhood I really love called Redfern, named after the humane doctor who finally said enough with these trans-Pacific voyages that end up killing a third of the people on board. Doctor named Redfern reformed those so that the survival rates were massively, massively higher. Anyway, whole neighborhood named after this humanitarian wonderkind called Redfern, in which is a little restaurant called Bush. That was my favorite dining experience. We have Australian listeners. I am not totally spitting into the wind here. Sydney-siders or Australians who are passing through Sydney, or anybody listening who is going to go to Sydney, please find the restaurant Bush. It was as if you took all of what I most love about Brooklyn, or at least Brooklyn as it once was before people like me ruined it, and all of what I came to love about Sydney and the parts of Sydney that are actually far away from Bondi Beach. Not that Bondi is not wonderful, but just far away from the iconic Sydney of the Opera House in Bondi. I found in this restaurant, the two overlap with one another. Bush. It's an amazing restaurant. We'll post a link to it. But please read The Fatal Shore. I can't stress enough. It's up there with The Power Broker and The Making of the Atomic Bomb. It's just a great nonfiction classic.
Man, I've been meaning to read that since we went to Australia, and maybe it's finally time. My take on Sydney was that it was a cross between San Francisco's topography, LA's weather, and sort of London's architecture, and that's a great combo. I also will say, we've been watching this show in my family, Stuff the British Stole, which is an Australian-based show about looted artifacts, basically. And the show's all right. That's not my endorsement, but it has put my children in the position of watching a lot of shots of Sydney. So we were all psychically with you, Steve, on your journey. Dana, should I give an endorsement a whirl here?
Yeah, sure. Go on.
Okay. So our regular listeners know I like to read mysteries that are conducted at a high enough level that you don't want to stab your eyes out at night. And I have found thanks to my husband and a thoughtful holiday gift. A new such series. It's a few years old. Probably some of you know it already, but it's called The Thursday Murder Club. It's by Richard Osman. It's set in a British retirement home. And essentially, if you liked the Ted Danson show, you will like this much better. It's like another murder mystery in a retirement home type show, but this is very effective, has an incredibly dry British wit. It's not quite as silly and goofy as P.G. Wodehouse's Jeeves books, but it occasionally the author will get off a line that is so dry it practically needs to be dehumidified for you to figure out to laugh at it. But it's just like a very, very well done, very arch, which is not a typical tone for a detective novel. They tend to be more straightforward or hard-boiled or thoughtful. This is like a goofy, slightly goofy one. Among the inhabitants of the retirement home is a former MI5 or 6 operative, a kind of retired labor leader, a nice little old lady who's forever poisoning people or drugging people who are coming to kill them. Anyway, it's a crazy mishmash of tone. There's literally like stolen diamonds and murders and false burials and whatever. There's a bunch of whatnot in it that you wouldn't expect that is not in the Ted Danson show, at least as far as I watched. But they're great. I think there's 4 of them now. Thursday Murder Club by Richard Osman.
Julia, I love your metaphor, but I think you mean rehumidified, not dehumidified.
Oh, yeah. Good point. Rehumidified.
All right. Both of those are very you. That was a very Steve endorsement and a very Julia endorsement. So I hope the one I'm about to give is a very Dana endorsement. Although I think, Julia, this is actually going to be really up your alley, too. I know you love dance documentaries and seeing backstage dance rehearsals and warm-ups and things like that. Or don't you share that love?
Yes. If you make a documentary about dance, I will watch it.
Yes, any kind of dance documentary, but especially those that spend more time in the rehearsal room than actually filming things on stage. So this recommendation comes from my daughter, who's such a good trawler of YouTube. She came across this documentary called The Soul of the Dance, which is a 1-hour-long documentary on Ulyana Lopatkina. Do you know that dancer, Julia?
No.
She was with the Kirov. She was a principal dancer with the St. Petersburg Ballet for a couple decades. I think she only retired about, I don't know, maybe 5 years ago or so. And I remember my family once seeing her on stage in Swan Lake and going in knowing that she was this famous ballerina. I think we'd even seen her dance in YouTube videos and things before, but being so struck by how different she was from even the other dancers in the Kirov, who are obviously some of the greatest ballerinas in the world, right? If you're any kind of dancer at the Kirov. But when she came out as the swan, the white swan and the black swan, it was like she was on a whole different level, doing something entirely different, acting through dancing in a whole different way. Just one of those kind of star quality performers. And since then, Ulyana Lopatkina and my family has always been this kind of lodestar for, the ultimate dancer. And so at some point, going through YouTube, looking for stuff on Ulyana, my daughter found this documentary, The Soul of the Dance, and it's just so fun to watch. First of all, the dancing is fantastic, right? But also, there's so much backstage rehearsal stuff, sort of seeing what life is like as a ballerina in St. Petersburg, getting your shoes made, showing up early to rehearse before anyone else gets there. She's also, unusually, I think, for a dancer or for any kind of physical performer, is very, very articulate and well-spoken about what dance means to her. She's just a real thinker about art and dance and expression. And so just the scenes when she's sitting, putting on her makeup in her dressing room, talking about a part she's about to go rehearse, are just a fascinating study of what it is to be an artist at that level. So I guarantee if you watch The Soul of the Dance, you too will become obsessed with Ulyana Lopatkina. We'll put a link on the show page.
Okay. I'm putting it in the mix. Wait, can I do one more call to our listeners since Steve found the best Aussie book to read for his Aussie trip? I have a trip coming up in a couple months. My family and I are going to go to Japan. We're going to spend some time in Tokyo and Kyoto and a little bit in between. What are the great nonfiction books to read about Japan? Send me your suggestions at culturefest@slate.com if you've got Rex.
Well, that does it for this week's Culture Fest. You'll find links to some of the things we talked about on our show page, slate.com/culturefest. You can also drop us an email at culturefest@slate.com. Our producer is Vic Whitley-Berry. Our production assistant is Kat Hong. And the composer of our theme music is Nicholas Bertel. For Stephen Metcalf and Julia Turner, I'm Dana Stevens saying thank you so much for being a listener, and we'll talk to you again next week.